At the dawn of the 18th century, Sweden was the regional superpower, the bouncer of the Baltic. They had a professional army that was, frankly, terrifying. Their empire stretched across Finland, Estonia, Latvia, and bits of Germany. In charge of this well-oiled machine was a teenager, Charles XII. His neighbors, a coalition of Denmark, Norway, Saxony, Poland, Lithuania, and Russia, saw a kid on the throne and thought, easy pickings. This was a historically terrible assumption. Their plan was to coordinate a three-pronged attack because, strength in numbers. It's a lovely idea on paper. In practice, coordinating anything in the year 1700 was a logistical nightmare, especially when the teenager you're up against is a military prodigy with a serious chip on his shoulder. Charles decided not to panic. Instead, he opted for extreme, methodical violence. First up was Denmark. With the help of an Anglo-Dutch fleet, he landed an army right outside Copenhagen, basically on the Danish king's front lawn. Denmark folded in a matter of weeks, one down. Next, he turned east to face the Russians besieging the city of Narva in Estonia. Charles arrived with about 10,000 men to face a Russian force of nearly 40,000. Bad odds for most people. Charles, however, was not most people. He attacked during a blinding blizzard, which, conveniently, was blowing directly into the faces of the Russians. The result was less a battle and more a catastrophic failure of Russian morale and command. Sweden's reputation was cemented. Russia's was not. After the Narva disaster, Tsar Peter of Russia did something unusual for a monarch who just got humiliated. He learned from it. He realized his army was a medieval mess and needed a complete overhaul. So while Charles was busy elsewhere, Peter started a massive, brutal, and surprisingly effective modernization program. He melted down church bells to cast new cannons, because God can wait, but the Swedes can't. He implemented conscription, drilled his troops in modern tactics, and hired foreign experts. He also started building a new capital city, St. Petersburg, on a miserable piece of swamp he'd just captured. Thousands died building it, but Peter got his window on the west. He was playing the long game. Charles, meanwhile, was about to get stuck in a very, very long side quest. Instead of finishing off Russia, Charles became obsessed with a personal grudge against Augustus the Strong, the Elector of Saxony and King of Poland. For the next 6 years, he chased Augustus around Poland-Lithuania. This wasn't a war, it was a royal manhunt. He repeatedly defeated Augustus's armies, deposed him, and installed his own puppet king, Stanislav Leszczyński. He effectively controlled the Commonwealth, but it was a quagmire. The place was politically unstable and drained Swedish money and manpower. All this time, Peter the Great was back in Russia, rebuilding, rearming, and retaking territory. Charles won every battle in Poland, but was slowly losing the war, a detail that seems to have completely escaped his notice. Finally done with his Polish hobby, Charles turned his attention back to Russia in 1707. His plan was simple: march on Moscow and knock Peter out for good. The Russians, having learned their lesson about open battles with Charles, simply retreated and burned everything. It's called scorched earth tactics, and it's brutally effective. Charles's army, one of the largest he ever commanded, was marching deeper into hostile territory with its supply lines getting stretched to the breaking point. Then came the winter of 1708-1709. It wasn't just cold, it was the coldest European winter in 500 years. Soldiers' birds literally froze in mid-air and fell from the sky. The Swedish army, far from home and starving, was being systematically dismantled by the weather. Apparently, checking the long-term forecast wasn't part of 18th century military planning. By the spring of 1709, the magnificent Swedish army was a shadow of its former self. Undeterred, Charles decided to besiege the fortress of Poltava in modern-day Ukraine. This was the final bait Peter needed. The new, improved Russian army arrived, massively outnumbering the Swedes. To make matters worse, Charles had been shot in the foot during a reconnaissance mission days before the battle. He had to be carried around on a litter, which isn't exactly great for morale or tactical command. The Swedish command structure fell apart. On June 28th, the battle began. It was over in a few hours. The once invincible Swedish army was annihilated. Thousands were killed, and the rest surrendered a few days later at Perevolochna. The entire army gone. Charles himself escaped, fleeing south with a small escort. His aura of invincibility was shattered, along with his army. Charles's dramatic escape led him to the Ottoman Empire, where he was initially welcomed as a guest who refused to leave for 5 years. He set up camp in Bender and spent his time trying to convince the Sultan to attack Russia. He was a diplomatic wrecking ball. He succeeded in starting an Ottoman-Russian war, which the Ottomans actually won, but they made peace instead of crushing Peter, much to Charles's fury. Eventually, the Sultan got tired of this stubborn Swede living on his dime and tried to politely ask him to leave. Then he tried to forcibly evict him. This resulted in the skirmish at Bender, where Charles and a few hundred loyal soldiers fought off thousands of Ottoman troops from his fortified house. It was completely insane, tactically pointless, and ended with his capture. The whole affair was so chaotic, it gave the Swedish language a new word, kalabalik, from the Turkish word for crowd or uproar. With Charles playing revolutionary in exile in Turkey, his old enemies smelled blood in the water. That coalition he shattered years ago? It was back and bigger than ever. Augustus the Strong kicked out the puppet king and retook the Polish throne. Denmark-Norway attacked Sweden's German provinces. Peter the Great, of course, was having the time of his life. He consolidated his control over the entire Baltic coast, capturing key cities like Riga and Revel. The Swedish Empire, which had been built on the strength of its army, was being dismantled piece by piece because that army was now either dead, captured, or stuck in the Ottoman Empire. Sweden's generals back home did their best to fend off attacks from all sides, but they were defending a hollowed-out empire. The Baltic was no longer a Swedish lake. After his capture at Bender, Charles was eventually released and decided it was finally time to go home in 1714. He rode incognito on horseback across Europe in just 15 days, a genuinely stunning feat of endurance. He arrived in Swedish Pomerania to find his empire crumbling. A normal person might have focused on diplomacy and saving what was left. Charles, being Charles, immediately started planning a new military campaign. He didn't want peace, he wanted revenge. His new target was Danish-held Norway. He scraped together new armies from a kingdom that was exhausted by war, famine, and plague. He was draining the last resources of his country to continue a fight that was already lost. His belief in his own military genius was unshakable, even when all evidence pointed to the contrary. He just couldn't stop. In 1718, during his second invasion of Norway, Charles was directing the siege of the fortress of Frederiksted. He was known for being reckless, often exposing himself to enemy fire to inspect the front lines. On the night of November 30th, he was in a forward trench. peering over the parapet. Then a single projectile, likely a musket ball or grape shot, struck him in the head, killing him instantly. The shot came from the fortress, but conspiracy theories bloomed almost immediately. Was he killed by the Danes, or was he assassinated by his own war-weary officers who just wanted the endless fighting to stop? We'll probably never know for sure. What we do know is that the death of the king immediately ended the campaign. The Swedish army just packed up and went home. The war, for all intents and purposes, was over the moment Charles fell. Peace negotiations dragged on for a few more years, but the outcome was clear. The Treaty of Nystad in 1721 officially ended the Great Northern War. The terms were devastating for Sweden. They lost almost all of their overseas territories. Estonia, Livonia, Ingria all handed over to Russia. Sweden was permanently reduced to a second-tier power. Their brief, glorious, and violent time as a great European empire was over. For Russia, this was a coronation. Peter the Great was officially declared Emperor of all Russia. His swampy capital of St. Petersburg was now secure. His nation was now a major player in European politics, a position it has, more or less, held ever since. The entire balance of power in Northern Europe had been redrawn, all because one king couldn't stop fighting and another knew when to learn from his mistakes. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel for more historical insights. Thanks for watching, nerds!